First question is, what was it like getting a personal tour of Philadelphia by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown?
As you might imagine, it was quite interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, the background to that was that the time that I became interested in Venturi and Scott Brown in the mid-1990s, at that particular moment in time, they were not popular in the way that they are now. In fact, they were probably the kind of pariahs in architecture. And the reason for that was all around the National Gallery extension, the Sainsbury wing, where they had been seen really as kind of agents of Prince Charles, because he had commented on a previous scheme that was done by a firm called Ahrens, Colerac and Burton, which was a modernist scheme, and he called this scheme a monstrous carbuncle on the face of an old friend, which is where, if you've ever heard of the Carbuncle Cup, the building design magazine run for the worst building of the year,
Rings a bell.
the Carbuncle Cup, the name comes from that very famous quote from the Prince of Wales. And because of that, the scheme got cancelled, and it was very controversial because he was arguing for a more classical design. There was a competition held, and Venturi and Scott Brown won it and did what I think is an amazing building for various reasons. We could perhaps talk about that, but maybe later.
Did they do the whole gallery, or just the
No,
wing?
just the bit on the end that's at the I think it's at the sort of western end of Trafalgar Square. My geography is not
It's
great,
just like the stairs leading up with the kind of arches.
Yes, the false arches.
That's it.
But that was very controversial, that building, at the time, because of its use of the classical language, which was seen as being pastiche, and which was also seen as being a kind of representation of Prince Charles having imposed his view. And so the architectural establishment were up in arms about that. The building was universally slated, and
this is quite an important time in architecture.
yeah, I mean, it was sort of at the end of, coming towards the end of the period that had been dominated politically by Margaret Thatcher. So that was another issue, because of the classical design, it was seen as perhaps being representative of her ideology. I don't think it is at all. Anyway, so Venturi was hated, and one of the reasons I was interested in him was because I thought, well, if everybody hates this figure and these buildings so much, there must be something quite interesting about them. And that was one of the reasons why I got interested in them. It was a slightly polemical position to take at the time. It's a little bit like, at a certain point at the end of the 1970s, you would never have worn flared trousers. So it was like totally, almost like a kind of evil thing to do. It was so naff. Being interested in Venturi in the mid-1990s was a similar position to that. So anyway, and then I wrote a review of a book about him, and I think this would have been in about 2002, I think. It was around about that time. And I think it was the first good press he'd had in about 10 years. So he wrote me a letter. He wrote me a letter, which, given that he was a bit of a hero of mine, was, it was very exciting. And it just so happened I was going to Philadelphia anyway, and we agreed to meet, and they gave us this fantastic tour we went to their house. We went to his mother's house, which is one of his most famous buildings, and we went to their office, and they took us out for dinner. But it was hilarious, because it was like, they say never meet your heroes, and I think that's quite true for most of in most cases. But on that occasion, it was an exception, because it was really, really fun day. Partly because of what they were like. Denise and Bob were like, as they were going round, they would be saying naughty things about other buildings they didn't like, They gave us the tour of the mother's house was great. It was like Bob had learned this. If you read what he wrote about that house, it's more or less what he said exactly. So it's like it's almost like he had this memorized speech that he gave.
So they were what people thought they were. They weren't putting up a facade of how
No, they were very genuine.
Yeah.
Bob was funny because across the street is a very famous house called the Esherick House, which is by Louis Kahn,
Yes.
who Bob Venturi worked for
Mm-hmm.
in the 1950s, and there was again a bit of sort of rivalry there.
Oh, really?
And he picked out all of the different bits that he thought were the best ideas in the house and said that he did them. So this very famous building by Louis Kahn.
So he worked under Kahn.
Yeah, Bob was saying, well, that was my idea and that was my idea. Oh, you see that window there? That was my idea. So he was claiming all of this. But I think the funniest thing was we went out, they drove us round, and Denise wanted to post a letter.
Oh, yeah.
And he wouldn't let her get out of the car until he came to a post box on the right side of the street, so she wouldn't have to cross the street to post the letter. And they were like bickering about this while we sat in the back of the car.
So it was you three,
it was the
Sam,
three, me, Sam and Charles.
you guys, the partners at FAP.
We were three of us, like three little
That should
children
be a movie, honestly.
in the back of the car.
That should be a movie.
Or maybe one day.
People would watch that.
So, yeah, she was trying to get, Bob, can we pull over and post this letter?
Surreal.
And
what was going through your mind then?
we were just like, kind of, this is just brilliant, you know. It was like we were finding it.
You couldn't get your iPhone out and start video.
No, well, the days before iPhones,
Yeah.
I'm afraid. And then later on, they took us out for dinner, and they were talking about stuff they liked in English culture. And we talked a bit about a TV show, The Sopranos. Don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's got this fantastic opening sequence where he's driving through New Jersey, and you see the New York skyline against this industrial landscape. We talked about this, and then he started talking about TV shows he liked that were English. So there was one which was called Keeping Up Appearances. You're probably too young.
I've heard of it. I've definitely heard of it.
It was about sort of suburban life and snobbery and stuff like that, and he loved that. And then he said, and what's the one with the priest?
The priest woman.
What's the one with the woman priest?
Yeah.
And he was like, we were sitting there going, oh my God, he's talking about the Vicar of Dibley. Bob Venturi and Denise Scott Brown sit at home at night watching end-to-end episodes of the Vicar of Dibley.
Who would have thought?
So yeah, no. So it was really a great day. It was and they were very human and very nice. And we met them several times afterwards.
Is that not surreal for you to think back at?
Yeah, it was a little.
Because even
bit,
you're in kind of Louis Kahn circle there.
Yeah, no, it was. But they're very much. The interesting thing about them is that they're very much outsiders still, or were at that time, in the American world. Because we were teaching at Yale, invited by Robert Stern, who's essentially a contemporary of. He's a little bit younger than Bob and Denise, but he was one of the other postmodern architects, and they were all seen as being very difficult. Indeed, they weren't popular amongst the the fraternity of architects. To be frank, I think a lot of it was to do with Denise being a woman and being, a bolshy woman, and it's a very male environment, that kind of echelon of American architecture, and I think there was a bit of that. But there was a sort of also a begrudging respect for them. And eventually, the last time we saw them in the States, they actually held a symposium at Yale about learning from Las Vegas that Denise spoke at. Bob was there, but by that time he was quite he'd sort of deteriorated quite a lot health-wise, so he wasn't really able to partake.
He had Alzheimer's, right?
He had Alzheimer's, and the early signs of it were there at that particular time.
And he passed away recently.
He died in I think it was August
Yes,
Was it August or was it August or September? I can't remember. Just last year.
Yeah.
But he was 90. I think 90.
Yeah.
So he wasn't.
It's incredible you had that experience there. I think that's quite a surreal thing. And what's even more surreal, I feel, is did he say he had sort of parting words for you, didn't he?
Yeah, what was great was because one of the reasons we were in Philadelphia is we'd been invited to give a lecture at the University of Pennsylvania, which they came to, and he said two things which were really fantastic. One, afterwards he said that stuff's not boring, but in a good way.
Amazing.
And then he said, keep up the bad work.
Yes.
Which was...
That's quite a loaded statement, though, isn't it?
Well, I think it was to do with... Because the work was going against the... I suppose the central tenets of what architects are taught is good design. And that's why, to a large extent... they were very provocative, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s.
Yeah.
It seems probably to architects of your generation perfectly normal to be interested in the vernacular, to be interested in a place like Las Vegas. But it was actually incredibly provocative thing to have done at the time. Like Las Vegas was out of bounds for any kind of architectural. It wasn't architecture. It was trashy. It was middlebrow. It wasn't high-end intellectual architecture. So it was completely out of bounds, and was obviously dealing with taste cultures that were an anathema to architects. And so, in a certain way, FAT was trying to do something similar in the 1990s, when what we used to call polite modernism became the probably most prominent form of architecture, quickly evolving into what I would now call PFI modernism. Schools and hospitals built under the PFI private finance system, which, all done in coloured renders and look really cheap, and it became the sort of, and are all literally wafer thin.
Yes,
it's a sort of, it's the language of a kind of late. It's sort of language of it's the certainly Tony Blair period of what that, if you were to pinpoint what architecture looked like in the period of Tony Blair, it was that.
Yes, I remember reading that in one of your articles. But I think this is a good segue into something you said in one of your lectures in 2007. By the way,
oh my goodness,
it has been very difficult to structure the plethora of information on you and the amount of sort of content you've contributed to journalistic kind of platforms.
Yeah, I've written quite a lot over the years.
So I've tried my best.
It's not rubbish.
But you said in one of your lectures in 2007 in New York, so the quote is, we were fortunate enough to start our practice in the midst of a terrible recession, which basically meant that nobody could give you a job, which meant you could do whatever you liked.
Yes.
Which you go on to say is a good thing, because it meant that sort of architects could stay away from developers. Now that we've kind of somewhat sort of recovered from the recession, sort of a decade ago, longer than a decade ago, I wonder, do you feel the sort of the new upheaval, that's Brexit, will also be a good thing for architects looking to design or think outside the box?
Wow, that's a difficult question.
Yes.
Well, of course, we don't know that Brexit's actually going to happen. What I think is one of the things about 1991 was when I left college and started, where this recession I refer to in that talk happened. And it was a very different landscape then. I mean,
Sure.
London, although it's still more expensive than other places, was nothing like as expensive as it is now. We were also very fortunate, our generation, in not having been loaded with the kinds of debts that students today are loaded with. And it meant that it gave you quite a lot of freedom at that time, because you could manage to live on not that much in London in a way that I imagine is very difficult to do now. And because of that, I managed to get a day teaching, which was, 200 quid or something, and it was enough to live on for the rest of the week, which meant you could do other stuff in the rest of the week. You weren't dependent upon having a 9-to-5 job. So that obviously gave us a lot of freedom to develop. What I think is different now, all of that stuff doesn't exist. It's much more difficult. I think it would be very difficult unless you were wealthy. I'm not from a wealthy background at all, but it'd be very difficult not to do that. But then again, students are doing other kinds. They're doing what you're doing. They're setting up a brand, or they're going into a makers collective, or they're going into research. And of course, all of this is facilitated by the kinds of technologies that were very, very embryonic.
Yes.
I mean, we had the internet was just really kicking in at that time. But we didn't have social media or anything like that. All our publicity was generated through print media at that time. But as far as Brexit goes, I don't know. If I'm really honest, I don't know. It's really unpredictable.
Well, I think that's
what will happen.
Yeah.
If Brexit indeed goes through. What might happen in the more wider political context, which I hope would be a good thing, will be a rejection of the ideologies of the last 40 years, and we might begin to not monetize everything, and we might begin to value education for its own sake, not as a product that students have to buy, and therefore have a tangible kind of outcome that they can say, I've spent my £9,000 a year and I've got this. Because we didn't think like that at all, because we didn't have to. So, and I think that kind of the political climate might change. I think in architecture there will be more things like public housing projects and publicly funded projects in the future. At least I hope so. And that might change the nature of the profession quite substantially. There are already some people going back into the public sector. Is it called public practice? There's an initiative at the moment to get architects working in local authorities in London. Again, I think it's called public practice. I should know that because it's run by somebody I know. And because in the 1960s, if you studied architecture, 50% of architects worked in the public sector for council architects departments and fire departments and the railways, and there's a fairly 50-50 chance you would have gone into the public sector. Margaret Thatcher closed down all of the public sector architects departments.
Really? This is news.
Yeah, so all of the things that are popular again now, the public housing schemes in places like Camden, Neve Brown's, Alexandra Road. I mean, that was all done under the auspices of Camden Council Architects Department. You would have departments of 150 people. I actually worked in one for British Rail when I did my year out. I worked in one of the few remaining public sector environments, British Rail, which a whole team of architects designing railway stations and signal boxes and
you got the drawings for that?
Yeah.
You did?
I did that was my first project. We were on railway stations.
I'd love to see those drawings.
Well, I can. If you ever go to Littlehampton, there's a wall next to the station, which is my first ever built design.
Oh, amazing.
It's not a particularly amazing wall, but I was very proud when it was built.
Yeah. It's not a contemporary barn or...
No, it was nothing like that. It was I hadn't quite worked out what I was doing. I was just happy to do a drawing and see something I'd drawn had been built. That was quite exciting at that moment in time.
I can imagine. Well, the reason I asked that question before was it kind of just to kind of get the viewers to understand, and myself to understand, the landscape that you started FAT in. And it was, like you said, it was a time where it was an odd time. It was a time where you could...
It's not as odd as it is now.
Really?
Well, anyway, we didn't have the likes of Donald Trump and
yes,
all of that
we'll get on to that stuff in a minute. But you had this sort of, I guess, window of opportunity to do something very different. At least that's what I've got from what I've been reading about. And you and two other gentlemen, their names Sam, Shaikh.
Well, originally it was myself, a chap called Clive Saul, and a guy called Kevin Robotham, who was Clive and my tutor at what was Polytechnic of Central London, now University of Westminster.
Right.
So FAT actually grew out of the University of Westminster.
Right.
Originally.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. But that kind of quite quickly disintegrated. I mean, Kevin's an amazing guy. He's still, I think, one of the best teachers, if not the best teacher I've ever come across. Amazing, incredibly inspirational.
Design tutor.
Yeah, yeah, and should be a lot more well known.
Is he around?
Oh yeah, he's around. He's around. But I mean, all the stuff that goes on in London schools of architecture and has done for the last sort of 20 odd years, what goes on at the Bartlett and a lot of all the experimental work that goes on in different schools of architecture, particularly across London, but is also fed into other places now. Kevin was hugely influential on that and doesn't get the credit for it.
Right.
Unfortunately, though, Kevin is also an incredibly uncompromising character. So he doesn't take any prisoners. So he's not. People don't find him easy to cope with because he's not afraid to, tell you things perhaps you don't want to hear, and so he upsets people.
Well, that's a trait of highly successful people,
yes.
Isn't it?
Yeah, and so I think that's one of the reasons why Kevin doesn't get the credit he deserved, because he managed to. He was not afraid to piss powerful people off, to the extent that he actually did piss
got any
powerful
examples?
Well, people who ran schools of architecture, famous schools of architecture. So yeah, I'll leave you to work out who they might have been, amongst others.
So he was actually part.
So he was part of it. I mean, it was really his idea
Wow.
to start it, and it was going to be a magazine. The sort of inspiration was Archigram.
Right. So when you say it was his idea, what was that concept? Sort of initial
Initially,
concept?
it was to start. Initially, it was to make a magazine.
Okay.
Because the other person who was at the college at the time was a chap called David Green,
Yeah.
who had been a member of Archigram.
Okay.
So, and who also taught me, is also a brilliant
Wow.
tutor. And so the inspiration for FAT was to make a magazine. That was where it started. And then we also started making kind of exhibitions, and then we did a project where we hired lots of bus shelters and sold them to people to put art in, bus shelter advertising sites.
And this magazine was premised on a concept?
Well, it was around about the time, other stuff that would have been happening at that time. One was the emergence of Mac technology, Apple Macs. So probably in about 1990 was the first time I'd ever seen an Apple Mac and what people could do on one, because a friend of mine who was quite involved in FAT later, called Paul Kira, who's a graphic designer, he was the first person I knew who had a Mac. He was making these Photoshop images, and we were all like, "Oh my God, you can like do that on a computer screen." So it was to do with that possibility of self-publishing that seemed to suggest, because you could do all the graphics and stuff yourself.
So magazines kind of would
evolving
into something different.
Nobody was really doing internet at this point. Like around about 1991, 92. I mean, there would have been some people. It hadn't taken off the internet. In the way that it's obviously become central to everybody's life now. So there was a sort of possibility we saw in using this technology, and we were also very interested in how you could create certain kinds of imagery using Photoshop that you would have had to have been, like Rembrandt or something to have been able to do before then. So it was sort of premised on that, and then it became a kind of collective of people. There was a time when there was about 25 people kind of involved in it. Nobody was making any money. No one was paid anything. It was a sort of. So there were people who were involved in it were like Lindsay Sears, who's quite a famous artist now. There was a guy called Dave Beach, who's quite a famous, well-known writer about art. There were all kinds of people who passed through. John Hardwick, who's now a filmmaker, makes loads of drama, TV. There was all these kinds of people involved, and we were also stuff that was going on at that time. At that beginning, we were quite close to Dazed and Confused magazine. So there's some of the very early editions of Dazed and Confused had features about fat, and then there was this burgeoning art thing. The YBAs, the Damien Hirst and all of those people, which were also a kind of inspiration, because you could see this was after a kind of a long period during the 80s when, because of the dominance of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party, there was almost a sort of suppression of culture in Britain. The idea of something like the Tate Modern existing then, people would have, well, why would you do that? That's not for people. Who's going to pay for that? But people aren't interested in art, contemporary art. So there was this big explosion of cultural activity that happened around that time, and I think, I wouldn't say we were necessarily going, oh, there's this great cultural explosion happening, let's be part of it, but you kind of
it just happened.
It was happening, and it was all to do with the risk of sounding like you're sort of mythologizing it, but there was a big scene around Old Street and Shoreditch and all of those buildings that are now, swanky hotels and expensive boutiques and restaurants and so on. They were all empty. They were all derelict. Shoreditch was derelict. If you went round Hoxton Square, there were all these derelict buildings. It looked like it was like it had been bombed or something. And there was a guy there who ran a festival called A Fate Worse Than Death.
Sorry, can I say just?
Oh, right. Sorry. Fate Worse Than Death. God, I should remember his name, but I can't. His name escapes me. He had a festival that we all used to take part in.
So this magazine Square. Kind of was like, you said there was like 25 people involved at one point. Almost as if it was just a kind of creative outlet.
Yeah, a dummy was done. It never appeared in public.
Where are these first magazines?
I don't know, actually. I don't know.
Someone must know.
Somebody probably does have them. God,
you should have
knows. Them. I think there was only one dummy run, because what stumped us was that we were still in the age of print technology. We couldn't get the money to print it properly. But yeah, oh God.
And then how did that translate? How did that evolve to?
Well, eventually we got some architectural projects. So we knew some artists, and one or two of them were doing things with their houses.
Right.
we were doing these projects with artists where we putting them in bus shelters and putting art on business cards and for sale signs and all kinds of things like that. There was a big nightclub scene happening around about then, because after the rave culture was more or less outlawed because of they had this they passed a law to stop these rave parties happening. Criminal Justice Act it was called, the Conservatives in the late 80s, and that meant all the nightclubs took off big time because all those people who were doing those raves. So we designed 3 nightclubs because we knew the people who were doing that stuff. And
so these people were approaching you.
Well, we were involved in it, and then you'd hear someone was like opening a club, and you'd go and say, "Oh, we could design that for you." And they go, "What's the budget?" "Oh, it's about 10p."
Bloody hell. So this was kind of almost accidental.
Yeah, but I think a lot of things are.
Right.
I mean, I don't know we ever had and I'm not sure anybody ever does. Maybe they do have a plan, and it just so happened that I think a big thing actually was teaching with Kester, because I'd started teaching with Kester around about that time, and because she at that time was a fairly senior journalist at Building Design magazine, when we did one of our first nightclubs, I think I must have said to Kester, "Can you help us get this published in Building Design?" And we took it in to see the editor, who at the time was a chap called Lee Mallet, and he took one look and went, "Oh, that's great, we'll have that on the front cover."
Wow.
Like, yeah. And I think it was because of our being involved in the club culture and our interest with the artists, and it meant that we had a very different attitude, and partly coming from what we've been taught at college by the likes of Kevin Rowbottom. We had a very different attitude to architecture that maybe most architects have. It was quite sort of frivolous, and we saw it as not being constrained by good taste, and that you could bring in things that were much more kind of communicative and a little bit kind of I suppose subversive. I mean, the trope of the garden shed on the interior is a kind of, you see it in students' projects. But when we did that in 1995, that was quite provocative. Nobody else had done that. So I think because of that, it just looked very interesting and fun and engaging and slightly naughty compared to what Norman Foster was doing, which was basically what BD's stuff that they were publishing. I suppose as well the fact that there was a lot less building going on these days. So,
right. Well, I suppose if it stand out today, back then it must have been.
Yeah,
they must have thought it was ironic.
Yeah, I suppose it was a little bit. I mean, literally, we were in our late 20s when we were doing this.
Yeah.
So,
because you say in one of your articles that in the spirit, because this is what I'm trying to understand is, I see all these kind of inspiration you have from Venturi Brown so Venturi and Brown, and you had these really incredible experiences with them, and then the architecture firm took this kind of took the world by kind of surprise, that it became I guess respected and incredibly. Especially when you think of, I mean, as soon as I mention, I've been talking to people, I'm going to get Sean Griffiths on it. They're like, "Oh, fat,"
Well, I'm glad still people remember who I am.
I don't think you know how sort of well known you are, but it is. You said in the spirit of exposing the relationships between fashion, architecture, and taste.
Yeah.
Which actually I was trying to find out where did the fashion come from? Where did the taste thing come from?
Okay, so that was to do with. I mean, that was quite specific. I mean, architecture speaks for itself in that, we were architects. Fashion was what we were interested in. Was on the one hand politics, and on the other hand, to a certain degree, technology and speed. And we were very, at that time, when all these new magazines were coming out, when the internet was just kicking off, when there was I think a very strong sense. I mean, I hope I'm not just being sort of nostalgic, but a strong sense of something bubbling under, that there was something new happening, and that it had something to do with technologies like the internet and new publishing technologies, and advertising kind of got quite interesting around about that time. It stopped being incredibly staid, and some advertising at that time was quite cool. And so there was this sense of things turning over very quickly, which went against the notion that architecture is timeless, because this is a kind of ideology of architecture. Oh, it's to do with timelessness, it's to do with deep meaning, and so on. And we said, well, no, it isn't. It's to do with fashion. It's to do with things that change over really quickly, and then you do this thing, and then a week later something else is. It never sped up quite to that level, but we were sort of engaged in, I suppose, that kind of idea that perhaps originated with somebody like Andy Warhol with the 15 minutes of fame. This idea that in a media culture, things turn over incredibly quickly. And I think that's true to a degree also in architecture. I mean, if you look at what the various fashions that have come and gone in architecture over the last 20 years, well, like modernism, you got 30 years of modernism before it started fraying a bit at the edges. Then you got 30 years of postmodernism, deconstruction, 5 years, Zaha, parametricism, another 5 years. We're now in another postmodernism back again, apparently. So there is this sort of turnover of stuff, and I think it's we go into all kinds of reasons as to why that might be. So that was one thing, and then and I think we were sort of quite prescient in a way of recognising that. So that was where fashion came from.
Right. So it was more of a philosophy.
Yeah, it wasn't to do with...
It's not actually clothes.
Clothes, no.
It's fashion in the sense that it's trend.
Yes. And it was very much to do with the idea... Because one of the worst things you could say, and perhaps still can, to an architect is, you're a fashionable architect.
Yes.
And they almost take that as an insult. Yeah. Architecture has nothing to do with fashion. It's all about deep meaning and timelessness. Yeah. And so it was sort of embracing that. And then the taste thing was to do with taste cultures. And again, I suppose that's related to some degree to fashion, but in a stronger sense, it's related to class politics and this stuff that's called good design. And round about that time, people were starting to talk about what good design was. Government ministers were talking about, we've got to have a thing like, which eventually became CABE. Yeah. Good design is this, and of course, good design is what people learn in architecture school, which is basically white male middle class kind of aesthetics. And of course the things that don't fit into that tend to get put in the category bad taste or not proper design. So we were embracing that stuff. So when we did that nightclub in Swindon, we made a surreal version of the living room of the kids who would go to that nightclub, and it was as if they were, so when they all like copped off with each other in the nightclub, it was as if they were like making out on their mum and dad's couch when mum and dad were out on a Friday night. But it allowed us to put these really kind of like grim, nasty Draylon sofas in a high design space, which was a relief, because I've always struggled with furniture. I can never pick furniture, so that making this sort of a kind of scenario which was a bit like a kind of Swindon living room as if filmed by David Lynch was trying to do. So that the taste thing was about engaging with these other cultures which are usually excluded from architecture.
And then you see so again the Scott Brown and Venturi inspiration. You can see that with obviously the iconography that you start to...
Well, they'd done it all before.
Exactly.
We were just copying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you're copying it, but you obviously took a lot of inspiration from them, and it was in that sort of iconography department, and using that kind of typical popular iconography. So I mean, you see like the quintessential gable end in the Blue House,
Yes.
and even in the Shaikh building, the sort of, at least this is my interpretation, the sort of brown crosses, which are almost Tudor house-like markings.
Yeah. No, I think that was. I think we evolved it a little bit, and it had a slightly more English sensibility than theirs. And I think actually Denise Scott Brown once said, which I took as a compliment, that our work was characterised by an aggressive prettiness, which I quite liked.
That's really cool. I always take that as a compliment too.
Yeah.
Wow. No, I mean, there is that sense of satire and irony, I feel, in those designs, and whether that was intentional or whether that wasn't.
It kind of was a little bit. We I won't shy away from. We were sort of pushing to see what we could get away with.
Yeah, but a little bit. What I'm interested in is this notion of. So you remember how. Of course, you remember how Robert Venturi said, "Keep up the bad work."
Yes.
And you also said that it wasn't. You said in the spirit of exposing the relationship between fashion, architecture, and taste, about which architects were in denial, we became postmodernists and cuddled up to the most reviled of architectural aesthetics.
Yes.
So it's just that. It's almost like there's a love-hate relationship you have.
Yeah,
with postmodernism.
it was, and we didn't like it. We didn't like postmodernism. It wasn't. We came to like it, but at first we didn't. It was almost like ugh,
so you did it to make a statement, essentially.
Yeah, it was
and you ended up liking it, and that's what you sort of talked about as the Stockholm syndrome.
A little bit, yes, yeah. I mean, I think the thing about it at the time was there was for me there was something at stake at that time in being subversive by using sort of postmodern, and a lot of my thinking is I've always been very political, and I'm always trying to think about this kind of slightly rarefied thing we do called architecture and how it relates to politics. I'm always thinking about that. So I think in that instance, there were two things going on. One, it was to subvert what we saw as the very kind of Islington middle class taste that was coming to the fore politically in the person of Tony Blair and the attitudes of the people around him. This new kind of, what I call polite modernism. On the other hand, the irony thing is very interesting because one of the things about postmodernism is that one of its tropes is irony, and the reason postmodernists were interested in irony was because postmodernism is also thought to be the end of ideology, the end of politics. So and the end of utopia. You couldn't utopian visions. According to the critic Frederick Jameson, utopia is a kind of dog whistle for socialism. You couldn't do that. So, all of the 1950s and 60s housing, which became discredited at that time, were seen as being, products of a kind of municipal socialism, and that had been rejected through Thatcherism. So you couldn't be ideological in a straightforward way anymore. You couldn't say, here's my utopian vision for the future, because no one would take it serious. So irony was a way of playing the game, but in a slightly subversive way, of doing something that on the face of it is kind of nice and cute and friendly, but it's got some kind of edge underneath to it. And it wasn't being utopian. It was like it was a critical view. It was having a little dig at the existing culture, because that was perhaps all you could do at that particular moment in time.
What would you say to people who say that it wasn't serious architecture? It was purposefully ironic, purposefully satiric, and I guess in some ways who question what is the place for that today, in terms of, can you do satirical and ironic architecture today?
Well, I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
I think in terms of people not taking it seriously or saying it's not serious, well, we certainly had our detractors. I have written somewhere a fantastic collection of below-the-line comments on articles that on the internet that Fat was featured in, which from time to time I like to read out at lectures. I mean, there's some, and I always enjoyed that because something people could get that angry about it amused me. But I never minded personally people saying, "No, this is just a joke," or what would we call court jesters of architecture. Yeah. I'm not sure my colleagues were as unperturbed by that as I was, but I never minded, and I think it was some people thought it was just a joke, and there was certainly an element of that about it, but in other ways it was very serious. I mean, there were three people who know their stuff doing this, and so I always used to say about the Blue House, it's South Park, which was a cartoon. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Yes.
South Park, which is this quite subversive, almost deliberately crappy cartoon. We used to say South Park on the outside, Adolf Loos on the inside. Or things like we are the master craftsmen of MDF, because we couldn't afford Adolf Loosian expensive marble and so on. So I'd never worried that much about people not, and it's a very English thing as well, not to take it serious, because it's taken seriously everywhere else. And I see, like, for example, in the United States, in Holland, where we did a lot of work, and people wrote about the stuff seriously. I think it's a very English. Maybe England is renowned. The English are renowned for a sense of humour, so perhaps they just don't want it in their architecture, because it's everywhere else. But in terms of doing it now. I mean, as you probably know, I wrote an article a while back on this subject that caused a bit of a furore. Largely
now is
people
not the time for postmodernism revival.
Largely amongst people who, up until that point, quite liked me. Maybe they still do, maybe they don't. But I wonder whether we're still in the postmodern age is one thing, and I think that for a number of reasons. One, the politics has definitely changed, and I think that's a product of the financial crash 10 years ago. The products of that are what is called populism. So on the one hand, you've got Brexit, Trump, a whole array of horrible Nazi-type people emerging in Europe, and on the other hand, you've seen the resurgence of leftist politics, which is, probably no surprise to learn where my sympathies tend to lie. And I think one can be utopian again. And in fact, I can't remember the chap's name, wrote a book called Utopia for Realists. He's this economist who's become quite well known because he had a pop at all the rich businessmen at Davos, saying they should pay their taxes. You lot need to be taxed more. So there is this sort of possibility again of talking about those kinds of stuff. I think irony is kind of dead when you've got Donald Trump. If you could have done irony as Donald Trump as President of the United States 10 years ago, ironically, but it's unfortunately all too real.
He satiated irony, and now it's...
And so playing about at the edges doesn't really cut it anymore.
That's such an interesting point. Honestly, when I read that, I was... because I've had to go quite deep with your work, because it is a lot. You've written a lot, and your writings are to a very high standard, I guess.
Oh, thank you very
much.
much.
In terms of trying to understand it as well. But yeah, I think that's really a surreal point, and Donald Trump is the perfect metaphor trying to summarize that point, that you were playing with these ironies, and that was the kind of Venturi Brown kind of it was their kind of style, and it worked for the time. But now we don't know what is ironic, and we don't know what is...
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because if you do a gold lift now, which you might have done...
They'll think you're serious.
Like 10 years ago, it was a kind of quite ironic... Not that we ever had the budgets to do gold lifts, but that would have been kind of very transgressive to have done at a particular moment in time. And it's still transgressive, but not in a way... It's transgressive in the Trumpian way now.
Yes.
It's because Trump is a transgressive figure, and his success is based upon his not being like other politicians, him daring to say things that other politicians wouldn't dare to say, and he does that extremely well, unfortunately. So I think that's one reason the politics have changed, and I think the economics, which is closely linked to it, because postmodernism is the realm of ideas. It's postmodernism is about not so much things, but human ideas about things. So the idea that everything is a text, everything is a representation, rather than just being the thing in itself, if you see what I mean. It stands for something outside itself. So, the Blue House has a cardboard cutout house to be a representation of a house, rather than being a house is a kind of play on that, an architectural manifestation of that idea. And I think there's a connection between that and money, because money, until 10 years ago, was this weird stuff that moved around countries, that the computers moved around to buy, to invest in hedge funds, and there was this kind of abstract entity almost that ran the world. And it was because times were not particularly harsh at that moment. We just thought that world was the way it was. But with the financial crash, the ramifications of that abstraction of money being just an idea, being some data on a computer screen that moves about, suddenly came roaring back into the real world, because people's lives would start to be directly affected by austerity and the taking out of money, and so it became a material thing again. And I think that shifts the dial a little bit in terms of postmodernism. And I think another thing which I find very interesting is the relationship between this idea of how you represent something and its relation to reality. And one of the things about technology is that there is an increasingly, I was taught you make drawings of buildings and then somebody goes and builds those buildings. There's increasingly, with 3D printing and all of that stuff, where the drawing that you make in something like Rhino is the same thing as the material that comes out the other end. It's the same. So that gap between a representation and its reality is being closed a little bit by technology, and it's kind of interesting, a sort of interesting example of that, because a lot of postmodernism is about the gap between a representation and its reality, and the play that you have of interpretation between those two things. So if I draw a house and I make a sort of beautiful pencil drawing and it looks like a house, it's a very different thing if I draw a cartoon cutout of a house. The way it's drawn means something different about the idea of house, if you see what I mean, in terms of the two. If you've got a situation, so a good example of that is, we used to use photocopiers. And one of the things we used to do when we were students is you put something on a photocopier, you'd move it around a little bit so that it would make a kind of distortion. And that was to do with the difference between when you copied it, the mechanism of copying it could distort it. And even if you make a straightforward photocopier, sometimes they shrink a bit in size. They're not quite the same thing as what you photocopied. It's a copy. It's a bit like a cell in biology, changing and mutating slightly. But if you duplicate a JPEG or a TIFF file, it's not a copy, it's a clone. It's exactly the same. So that sort of distance between representation and reality is closing. And I think that's another thing that brings back into the realm of the material. Postmodernism is an anti-materialist philosophy.
Wow.
Sorry, I'm getting too complicated.
No, man, you're opening my mind up to this in a whole different way. I mean, I would love to, if you could summarize what postmodernism is in like a sentence.
A sentence. I think it's a world where reality is superseded by its representation.
Wow, yeah, that's a good one.
It's the representation that becomes important. A good example of this, a very direct example of this, is politics. So in the Blair era, presentation,
Okay.
not substance of actual policy, apart from a bit of tinkering around the edges.
Why is it called postmodernism then? I mean, it's a weird title to give such a, I guess.
I think it's partly because it's a historical thing that came after. It's a shift in ideology. Because unfortunately, whoever coined the term modernism created a problem for those who wanted to categorise changes in era or paradigm or epoch or whatever, because that's you've kind of closed the door on everything else because everything's modern. That's why we have to use the word contemporary now. And so postmodernism was because there were certain things that were taken from modernism into postmodernism. A certain level of abstraction in visual culture, for example, still remains. But it was about rejecting some of the ideas of modernism, and modernism was very kind of material. Modernism was like it is what it is. Carl Andre does a load of bricks on the floor of the Tate, and it is what it is. It's some bricks. It's not trying to represent anything. It's not trying to be anything. It doesn't
carry any connotations.
It's a piece of material arranged in a particular way. Whereas postmodernism is all representation. It's David Hockney, the colours of a swimming pool, and
I think that's a perfect segue onto. You recently did an installation in Folkestone, because you're talking about this kind of the representation, the gap between representation and material being increasingly decreased. And you did this installation called Levitation 1 and 2, which reflected your interest in the relationships between the realities of 3D, time and space, and the problem of its two-dimensional representation. You actually use different types of mathematical representations in the paintings to create sort of levitating pieces of art, of objects that kind of oscillate between stasis and movement.
Correct. Very good.
and kind of coherence and discontinuity as well. And there's that kind of duality of. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about that? And
it used as a technique, which is quite a familiar technique, called anthropomorphism, which is basically there were a number of big objects drawn across the walls and the ceilings and the floors of this gallery space. And it was called Levitations because it relates to an earlier piece of work, but it was also, these were like these big objects that were effectively floating in the space.
Yeah.
And it's that thing that gets used a lot. You see it, like the advertising that's put on the pitch on a football game, where it's made from the camera view to look like it's stood up. It's using a very similar technique.
There's a famous example of that, actually, with the Channel 4
Yes.
thing.
Yes.
Moving the camera and then suddenly
Exactly.
it lines up. As
So it is using exactly the same mechanism, but with these objects. So you come in from a particular view,
yeah.
and there are all these kind of weird shaped things on the wall, and when you move to a particular position, it coalesces into a coherent form, exactly like the Channel 4 thing. I think the difference was that in my thing there were 3 objects, and they were all, the positions were different, so you would never see all of them all at once. So as you moved around, these things start shifting about. And what I was, I'm partly interested, if you like, in the conceptual idea of them being incoherent as a 3-dimensional thing, even though they are a 3-dimensional thing because they're in a 3-dimensional space, and they're up the wall and they're on the ceiling and they're on the floor. And this one point where you see it as a drawing. So it was like being in a drawing kind of thing was part of the idea. And it was partly also inspired by some philosophical stuff that I've been interested in the last few years, which is related. It's a sort of big jump from postmodernism to some. It's related to some respects with some ideas in physics about how, and also to some extent in neuroscience, about how the world we see and we perceive and understand and experience, which is a big part of architecture, because we talk a lot about what people experience in architecture, but physics and neuroscience are starting to tell us that what we see and understand about the world is actually does not necessarily correspond to the way it really is. So at certain levels in physics, at micro sort of subatomic particle level, and in the cosmos, there's all kinds of weird shit going on. Is kind of
but it isn't.
Yeah, would make no sense.
Yeah.
And some philosophers are trying to write about, well, what's the real nature of things?
Yes.
And is our experience of the world is not just based on, if you like, our empirical experience. It's also based on a kind of knowledge base, but it's also increasingly, again, like technology, changes the nature of our subjective experience all the time. I'm interested, for example, I'm taught as an architecture student about urbanism, and we were taught about a character called Kevin Lynch, who wrote a book called The Image of the City, and it's about how you make the city legible. So you have landmarks, and you shape streets and things in a particular way to help people feel comfortable moving around a city. And this is still, I guess, current urban design practice to do this, but I'm interested in the idea that now anyone who's going anywhere gets their phone out and looks at where they've got to go, and quite often will follow directions, and that's a kind of augmented reality, isn't it? It's you're using your experience is not just the same experience that medieval man would have had. It's augmented by this machine that also happens to be connecting you with the whole world simultaneously. I mean,
it's a new dimension almost.
Yeah, well, it's extraordinary when we think about it, that we have that access on this little device, which will probably no doubt become a pair of glasses or a chip in
Oh,
your
they
head.
already are now, yeah.
Yeah, you know.
Well, they say that your phone is more powerful than, the first rockets that were made. But it's that I love that philosophy you're talking about, between the sort of the subjective experience and what we think is objectivity.
Yes.
And that is relativity in its sense, isn't it? So
Yeah.
you have one light, you could take a torch and move it like that. To me, it's just getting smaller and bigger.
Yeah.
But to someone over there, it's just going left and right.
Yeah.
And actually, the whole two worlds thing, which is the brand name, is premised on a very basic notion that architecture kind of operates in that threshold between external world, which is the built form and what we try to put into it, and what we exist as, and then the kind of internal world. So those two worlds is primarily the focus of architecture, of how we experience the external world. And that's why I really loved this installation, because it seemed as if doing that kind of design intervention forced people to use the space in a completely different way.
Yeah, it made a certain
Encouraged.
kind of movement. It made a certain movement around the space, because there were particular points where a particular view of you walked in a certain way. I mean, they're quite amazing, these things. It like kind of, you see something that looks like a pointy thing, and as you walk past it, it shrinks.
Yeah.
It looks like something that's animated in the surface. I'm very interested in that stuff to do with the difference between your perception and reality, because of course the thing isn't changing at all. It's your perception of it that is changing.
Definitely.
And that tells us something about when architects talk about, for example, experience as a ground for how you design things, which is talked about a lot, that's one way in which your experience is not what you think it is, and it raises questions about whether one's subjective experience should be the basis for how you design things. Because there's all kinds of ways in which your subjectivity is distorted.
Yeah.
Particularly these days.
Definitely. That's very interesting. And within that, what I find of personal interest in me, I'm actually writing my dissertation on how architecture can influence behavior and emotion.
Okay.
And it's a notion I'm very interested about. It's almost as if you're coding the space to make people operate in a certain way. And obviously that carries very sinister kind of vibes to it. And you know that's why I'm looking at the notions of Taylorism and Fordism in the past, where they would design a space to get the most efficiency out of someone. But then you have the very altruistic notions of it. Even Denise Scott Brown talked about creating crossing points where you're not actually forcing people to meet, but you can only so much so kind of create the networks that encourage people to meet. And I feel like this installation kind of had that, because you would walk into it and you'd suddenly notice, what are all these lines? And then you'd be like, oh, wait a minute, everything's changing as I move. And that's not the normal function of someone, how they use a space. You don't see them coming in a room and starting to dance around. But I wonder,
got any architecture clients wanting to do that, because they're like, oh god, that's a little bit weird.
But I feel like those notions then could conjure up a very interesting way of designing.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you think of. What do you think is the potential for architecture to influence people behavior?
Well, it's probably enormous. I mean, to a certain extent, it probably does already.
Yeah.
Because
you wouldn't have a field called environmental psychology if it didn't.
Yeah, and there's how one behaves entering certain kinds of environments compared to it's to do with what you associate with those environments. So if you go into a rich person's giant country house in a Georgian style, it's probably quite different from going to your mate's flat round the corner. Even though they're both bricks and mortar, it's something different about the way you behave. I mean, and obviously, again, technology could play quite a big part in this. But I think an interesting subject area is, some of the neuroscience around this stuff, which is questioning things to do with free will. That to what extent do we really have free will? Because unfortunately, again, certain not so scrupulous political operators have noticed that if you can trigger people's behaviour through social media, for example, and you can target them with certain things, and it will touch a nerve that will, one of the questions about that, and we all do it. It's not just a question of one particular political group doing it, but there's a question. We're all triggered by certain tropes that are, to do with things that we're interested in or passionate about or have strong views on. But so there's that. It's how neuroscience, how these triggers, more and more is obviously being learnt about this stuff. So the potential for that sort of thing in buildings is enormous, and as you say, is philosophically and ethically a very tricky area, because such things could be put to good uses. So, for example, if you could do something which, for somebody who's going into hospital to have an operation, where you could trigger calmness and relaxation and in that person, that's obviously a very good use.
Definitely.
But if you can trigger other things,
definitely, yeah,
the might not be so pleasant or
and as
benevolent
far as
that.
Yeah, and as far as sort of design philosophies go, I've been sort of pecking around your studio at uni and asking people about what it's about. By the way, you do remember you did interview me on getting into uni, right? How could you forget?
I couldn't. How could I forget such a handsome face?
Yeah. So no, I mean, you were actually the second choice of my studio, because I didn't quite understand, and obviously that I don't think that's a criticism as much as it's more of a lack of understanding on my part.
I think it's a risky thing we ask students to do, and I think I can understand a certain amount of reticence from students. I'm not sure I understand it either.
Well, that's the thing. They said it was sort of called Indeterminate Design. Was that the term? What does that mean?
It's linked to some of the things we were just talking about to what extent do things that we think of necessarily as functions of the mind operate in architecture, either in its use or in its design or whatever. So we talked a little bit about free will. So a big thing about, you'll have been in a jury, a crit, and you'll have been asked, why did you do this?
Yeah.
And my contention is that most designers don't really know why they did that. They may have a story to tell about why they did it, but that's not necessarily the same thing as why they really did it. I mean, and more honest answer in some students' cases, it would be, I did it like this because I really love the work of Ram Koolhaas and I wanted to copy it. But they would never say that.
Yeah, you're right.
And not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I was interested in what happens if you take out intentionality or in some way augment it or interfere with it. So basically we use chance operations, and the word indeterminate means it's not a predetermined idea. And it's basically just using a technique that was developed by the American composer John Cage, who wrote music by tossing coins, and through the use of a book called the I Ching, which is a sort of Chinese book of wisdom. So, I mean, it'd be too long to explain exactly how it works, but basically you toss coins and you get a figure, you get a number as a result of this. And there are various things in the book, or there are various ways you can use the number to make you do things that you wouldn't necessarily think of doing in a rational way. So, for example, you might toss a coin and it tells you to perform an act on piece of material. So it might say you should shave this, or you should drop it on the floor, or you should carve a strip out of it, or you should saw it in half and put it back together again, or whatever. And you wouldn't necessarily think of that, of doing that, but you do it, and you end up with something, an object. And what's interesting about that, to me, is that, one, it's not generated by a rational process, and possibly would not be generated at all by a rational, because you wouldn't think of doing some of these things. And two, you're forced to talk about the object, not the idea behind the object. You talk to get to grips with the nature of an object. And I think that's very pertinent to architecture, because that's what people encounter. They encounter architecture as an object. This door handle, these seat things, this tabletop. They don't encounter the idea behind this stuff. So it's a very inventive and incredibly creative way of designing. It also takes students out of their own consciousness, because they're not doing something that they would have predetermined themselves. It does away with the need, which I know a lot of students have this problem. I've got to have an idea before I do something.
Yes.
And that my idea, we just do away with. There aren't any ideas.
Wow.
There's an ability to talk about something and what you might do with it afterwards, and that's all it is. And I've taught for over 25 years. I dread to think, and I like to think I've got better at doing it as time has gone on. But I think this has been the most interesting teaching experience. So the other things we're doing, people might make an object which might become a component of a building. It'd be a slightly weird thing, but we get students to swap with each other. So it's not this, it's my thing. Because each student will use something in a very different way to somebody else. So again, there's a sort of collective notion of how the studio might work, which in a funny way is closer to what practicing in architecture is really like. It's very rare that somebody designs a building, every single square inch of it, and it's just that one person who's doing it. It's a team effort.
Well, that's kind of again very controversial in the sense that there's no kind of personal originality there. But it is the most original kind of result possible.
Well, I hope so. I hope it's very original in terms of what's produced, but it isn't totally connected to the person who produced it.
Yeah.
And
How does that go in terms of critiquing someone's work in that sense? Because if it's not their product.
Because it's how they use it, to how they deploy it, and what they are able to, how they understand it as an object. To what use you put it. I mean, it goes back all the way back in a way to, if you talk about the Blue House, I didn't invent the shape of a child drawing of a house. So sort of square with a triangle on the top with a chimney and a curly smoke coming out and windows with crosses in it. I didn't invent that. That existed a long time before I did. But it's how you use it, and it's the same thing. I mean, it's slightly different because that obviously has a kind of particular iconography that these objects that our students make don't. But it's making you think. Again, it comes back to this idea about materiality, and thinking through an object in terms of trying to think about it in and for itself. So this object, it looks unbalanced, or it's heavier at the top and lighter at the bottom, or it's a strange combination of materials that give it a feeling like it might be just about to collapse, or it's something that looks like the strongest thing ever made. And to think about it in those terms rather than I invented a narrative about people grown their own food in the city or whatever, thinking about it, because I think architecture, of course, it's about organising space and activity, but it's ultimately about stuff, physical stuff.
The value of object.
Yeah, and even, the proof I always think is in buildings. Like if you went round London today, there's a huge percentage of the buildings that exist that are not used for what they were originally designed for, which tells you that there's no necessary relationship between the function or program of a building and how it is, physically.
Yeah.
A good example I always think is the AA School of Architecture, which is a Georgian house, or 2 or 3 Georgian houses, which of course is an architecture school, and the actual certain qualities that certain events, certain things that happen in that school are to do with the form of the building, creating this warren of spaces, and that influences the way that the school operates and the ethos of the place. In the same way that our building down in Marylebone also does that, but that's designed as an architecture school, so it operates in a slightly different way as an architecture school. Operates very well, I think, as an architecture school, but it could equally, you could convert it into a hospital. You could make quite a nice hospital.
Airport.
Or an airport. You need a runway. I don't know where you'd turn Marylebone Road into a
just
runway.
A road, yeah. It'd be nice, right? That's really interesting. It's from what I understand it, and from what I've seen from the studio as well, is the work is unlike anything else produced in the uni because of you've taken out that kind of the element of conformity, and there's this. I feel like it's not just conformity in the concepts we extract from other places, which is completely broken down in it seems in this indeterminate sort of philosophy, but also in kind of conforming to following the basic design process, which is feasibility, to how do you procure this, and then we refine it. It's completely taking away that standard template, if you like, and I think that's incredible.
Well, I think a lot of this, to be fair, a lot of the studios don't necessarily follow what would be a normal kind of practice-based way of doing things, and I think others as well are doing interesting experiments around what you can do with architecture which you have a certain freedom to do in the School of Architecture because some of the constraints. But that doesn't mean it's not related to real world thinking. But yeah, I'm reticent to make too many claims for it because it's an experiment. Yeah, it generally seems to have worked. I have a slight problem with it at the moment in that what has happened, which I suppose is inevitable, is that the absolute opposite of what was supposed to have happened has happened, in that it's developed a little bit of a house style, which is kind of absolutely not what it's supposed to do. But I think, there's a certain inevitability because students will look at what they saw and they say, this is what's expected. And actually it's not. So we're trying to introduce some of the Fab Lab type technology into it. And I say trying because as a man of a certain age, I'm less kind of au fait with those kinds of technologies and how they actually operate than perhaps some of you guys are, because you sort of used it all and are used to the way of thinking that goes around it. So I'm trying to slowly catch up a little bit on some of that stuff so that we might bring, or perhaps we have encourage the right sort of students who know that thing. I think one of the attractions of the students is so much of it's handmade, and a lot of them have been, in computer world for a long time, and they find it very, very liberating, I think, to suddenly be doing kind of crappy drawings again, and sort of things that are slightly less tight and controlled.
And you currently work sort of under the company name Modern Architect, is that right?
Yeah, it would probably be a stretch at the moment to describe it as a company.
Yeah.
Yes, I have decided, and it's something I'm always toying with. I mean, for the last 5 years or so, I wanted to try some other things, and I'm experimenting with how I practice. So I'm doing some architectural projects, one of which is some additions to the Blue House and renovations of the Blue House. I'm also doing these installations, one of which you described very eloquently. I'm doing a lot of writing and thinking about things, and then there's the teaching as well. So it's pretty full on. And occasionally I'm asked to do interviews like this, which also take up some of my time. And I'm always going, should I get the practice up and running properly and employ people? And then somebody reminds me of what that's like, and I go, no, excuse me, I have to. And then because it's a if you develop your brand, you'll find this. I don't know if you've got anybody else involved in it at the moment, but I hold my I take my hat off to almost anyone who gets a creative business off the ground, particularly if they're dealing with something that's not overtly market orientated, and manages to keep it going. Because it's extraordinarily difficult thing to do. Not because because it's not just about talent. It's amazing perseverance, and it's quite frankly quite stressful running a business, because if you have employees, you're looking after them as well as yourself. That comes with you're not just paying your rent, you're paying everybody else's as well, and that's quite if you care about the people, that's quite a thing to take on. And and it's difficult.
Definitely.
You get people who don't want to pay you and stuff like that, so it makes life. So I was hoping to having a bit of a rest from that for a while, but there are some. I've still managed to do some quite interesting projects just on a smaller scale, which I've kind of enjoyed. It's given me some real thinking time through the project, which you don't always get when you're running a practice, because you're running from pillar to post, trying to keep the show on the road and have it doing its good stuff and keeping everyone happy.
Do you think you would take a project on if it was sort of traditional architecture?
Yeah, if it was the right sort of project,
you would.
Yeah, definitely, if it was the right sort of project. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I found increasingly difficult to do around dealing with developers. I mean, I did work with some very good developers, but they're thin on the ground. And good for architects, I mean, ones that care more than just about the bottom line. They're hard to find.
Surely that would be getting worse as a result of Brexit. The more developers kind of being
possibly
more power.
It might, but it's also there might be more, because they've got away with murder for years. Developers carte blanche to do what they like. Really, I mean, they'll say, "Oh no, we haven't," but they've been allowed to take over. They've been basically given large tracts of London housing estates to redevelop make loads of profits out of.
Well, I don't know if this is right, but maybe Grenfell is kind of a symptom of...
Well, that exactly is. I mean, that is a symptom of the way that development works, where it's all separated and outsourced, and there's nobody where the lines of responsibility are for checking things are done properly is become blurred. Obviously there's an inquiry into what happened at Grenfell, so we don't actually officially know. But I mean, that sort of thing, I mean, and a much smaller and much less horrific, catastrophic events, but bits of buildings fail and fall off all the time because they're shoddily made, because it's not in the contractor's interests to make them that well, because they're given carte blanche to do it. And I think that's very difficult for architects, because I mean, the old adage, to do a good piece of architecture, you need a good client.
Yeah.
But when a client is a massive property development company owned by its shareholders, who are putting pressure on its senior managers to deliver the dividend, shareholders who are quite distant and could sell their shares at any time, then the incentive to do things to a certain level of quality in certain instances is not there. And that, people will always take the path of least resistance.
Yeah. I guess one thing you can't blame developers for, or at least not this kind of definition of developers, is what happened with Notre Dame just now.
No.
So that fire was not, I guess, developer. But I don't know what did cause that.
I think it's just because in renovation projects like that, I mean, obviously the standards of fire safety.
Yeah.
We say that we've had Grenfell, which is supposedly a modern building that was supposedly safe. There are obviously different standards of fire safety existed in medieval cathedrals than should exist today. I just think it's people occupying spaces and working in spaces when a renovation is going on that they don't usually occupy. So there's people using electrical tools up there. There's probably things that might generate sparks. There's people might leave the plugs left in. I mean, who knows? It's just I think it's understood as a standard risk when a building that's very old is being renovated.
Yeah,
it's because there are activities that could cause a fire. But it's a compliment to the quality of French masons that the stone roof survived it. Medieval stone masons
and people very happy about the stained glass piece as well, which survived.
Yeah, obviously it's a tragic thing.
So Emmanuel Macron kind of announced a new sort of international competition to rebuild the spire.
Yes.
What do you think?
I think it should give it to Norman Foster. He should do a tulip-shaped one.
He might be watching this. No, but seriously, if FAT was to take that project on in its prime, what do you think would have come about?
What, a spire? I don't know. I mean, it's a fiendishly difficult project. I mean, I haven't seen the competition brief. I've read it in the, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, they said something about it reflecting the technologies of today or something. So I don't quite know what the. But yeah, I mean, it would be interesting if they were to be brave with it and do something contemporary. I mean, that would be quite. I mean, it would be very controversial, obviously, but it might be quite interesting because people forget. I mean, it's one of these things that we preserve everything in aspic these days, but a Gothic cathedral, it develops over a long period of time. You know, they're not developed as a sort of final design at all, in the way that a modern building is. Because I mean, it took 200 years to build that. So the people finishing it were not working to the same ideas as the people who started it. And then there were additions to it in the 19th century. So Viollet-le-Duc, who actually designed the spire, I think pretty sure that's a 19th century addition. So they were not so fearful about doing that stuff at that time. in a way that we tend to be now.
Yeah, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? And big glass.
It would be very brave to do it, but I think we should maybe be able to have a sort of confidence in our own time to do something like that. You know, it's incredible.
And the story that could kind of come with it, you know, would not just sort of an icon or a symbol, but I mean, I want you to try and think who this quote is by, but tell me what you think of this. So perhaps herein lies, I think it's a sort of a notion to do with, I guess, an ideal way of designing today. Perhaps herein lies a clue as to how to proceed, perhaps towards an architecture that embraces the tactile and strives heavily to actively resist visual signification, that tries to disappear, that abjures meaning, an architecture that makes no attempt to speak and can tell no lies.
No idea.
An architecture of silence that has nothing to say and is saying it. Who's that one?
I can't. The name won't come to me.
Well, I can tell you, it's a very wise man called Sean Griffiths.
Oh, very good. I must read him.
No, I think that's a lovely, lovely, lovely thing to say.
Thank you.
And coming from a new generation of designers, I guess, it's something I guess it's a way of design I feel passionate about, and it's nice to hear someone of your kind of background and stature to say that as well, and especially with the podcast I did with Mandy, which was all about ignoring the kind of ocular-centric approach, visually obsessed approach. There's so much more to experience with architecture.
Well, it's sort of interesting to go, if you designed something from the point of view of somebody who is visually impaired or blind, it would still look like something, but it might be driven by touch and sound and what things feel like underfoot and what handrails feel like and so on. But what it looked like visually would not necessarily be driven by a visual. And I just think that's an interesting idea, because it could actually create something that is visually quite interesting as much as anything.
Exactly.
But also it's to do with an idea of how we truly inhabit buildings, because we don't look at buildings in the way that we talk about them as architects. You know, we're not in buildings all the time looking at them, at the facade and looking at its composition. We actually inhabit them in a much more everyday and they're a kind of background. And I'd like to sort of one day, I haven't quite got my head around how to do it, write about that, about how you think about how does one appreciate something disinterestedly, in the sense of
a kind of subconscious
perception. How are you aware but not aware that you're in something, in some sort of environment that is working in one way or another?
Wouldn't that be down to maybe what if someone was measuring the physiological response of a person in a particular environment?
Possibly.
Or a psychological response?
Possibly. You know, you'd all go around with these funny hats on with he's measuring all your brain patterns and stuff. I don't know, it's just a slightly different way to because we always think in terms of the spectacular.
Yeah.
And I sometimes wonder to what extent people look at buildings like that. I mean, I'm sure they do. If you go on holiday, you're in Florence, you look at the Duomo. But the everyday, it's an interesting one. If you ask somebody to describe the buildings of Oxford Street, they can probably tell you where all the shops are, but not what it looks like above, because you don't look at that. Or at least people who are not architects, I don't think. Architects might look up.
Definitely. Well, that was it. I think that was... I felt at the crux of everything that you write about, that you've done with Fat, and even before that, there was this kind of, I guess, way of looking at things from a deeper perspective, where you would try to really understand how people perceive architecture and space. And that's something, would you say that's accurate?
Well, I think that I probably would think more like that now, not because I wasn't thinking like that necessarily at the time, but because I probably didn't know I was thinking like that. I mean, you also need to understand that, you know, I obviously I've developed a body of knowledge over, you know, 20 odd years of experience, but I didn't have that knowledge necessarily when I was starting. You know, I think it's about being open-minded and trying things out and saying, what happens if we do this? And if something happens, you know, often you can't quite put your finger on what it is. That there's something about this that is interesting or is kind of bothersome in an interesting way, and I can't describe it at the moment, but perhaps in time you look back and go, oh yeah, I can see what that was doing now. And I think so. I don't think we necessarily, I think the things I'm trying to do now, both to an extent in my own work, but particularly with the students, is trying to get that back of not knowing what you're doing.
Right.
You know, not knowing why you're doing this, not knowing what the outcome's going to be, because that's exciting, sort
Definitely.
of unexpected. Because you know you can learn to play the piano and play it perfectly after a while, and then after you think, well, is this interesting? What happens if I just smash a hammer on the piano and drop a water bottle on it, and you know, not that I can play the piano.
No, I mean, that's brilliant. I mean, I think that kind of summarizes the kind of approach you have to things, and that's what I was really hungry to understand.
Good. Well, I hope I've helped.
Definitely.
A little bit.
Definitely. I think just to close it off now, we had a little question. We'll just get it up from a fan, I'd like to say.
Really? Shouldn't there be a phone in at this point?
I wish. So I think it's generally trying to ask about more practical questions. This is actually by Adam Nathaniel Furman.
Oh, right, okay.
So a big fan of yours. He said,
I'm glad he is.
Yeah.
After I upset him.
He says, how did you progress your career? Sort of finance the office, and how do you sort of bring in work now? Which I think we vaguely covered.
Yes.
But he's kind of after the more practical information.
Well, it's difficult. I mean, I understand where Adam's coming from, because he's a very talented guy who's obviously doing something which is very idiosyncratic and unique. And I unfortunately, I have to say to Adam, he's doing extremely well. And that's... How did we finance it? We financed it by doing teaching, so that gave us some form of income. By not paying ourselves for quite a long time. I mean, this is probably not what he wants to hear. And using that to build up the reputation to a point where eventually somebody gave you a break. And I think I was probably 5 or 6 years of earning nothing from Fat.
Wow.
And then probably another 5 or 6 years of earning very little.
Wow.
But supplemented by teaching and, you know, living frugally, you know, not you know, I still haven't bought my Mercedes Benz, probably never will. No, definitely never will. And I think you just go, I mean, my advice to somebody like Adam would be, you just got to keep going, mate. You've got to keep going, and your break will come eventually. It just takes time and perseverance, and, you know, not unfortunately a degree of difficulty and hard times and struggle.
That's really.
You know, they don't say the tortured artist for nothing. People
Mm.
think it's a psychological thing. It's like Van Gogh cutting off his ear.
Mm.
A lot of it's financial. You know, unless
Well, he's
you're
actually
really
brought in a lot
lucky.
of-
Unless you're lucky and get a really early break,
Yeah.
it's tough. But I think, you know, Adam will, his moment will come.
Yeah, he's already brought in quite some pretty major jobs, I think.
Yeah,
Up
I
in
mean, I
Tokyo
don't know
and
what he's
Japan.
working on. I'm sure his moment will
Mm.
come.
And then in terms of today, sort of, how you finding getting clients now?
Well, it's a little bit easier
Because you've got
because well, because, you know, I'm at an age where the people I know
Yeah.
are perhaps potential clients in a way that they wouldn't
Mm.
have been 20 years ago. So people I know are, you know, in senior positions in companies or own a house that they might. I mean, actually, a lot of my work is friends who are the same age as me, who, you know, are now probably at the peak of their earning power as people in their, you know, middle-aged and have careers and kids and families and have a house, and they. So a lot of my work is that actually. So when I run out of them, then I don't know.
Get your bends.
Then I don't know. But my Adam, your time will come, my friend. It has already. You're more famous than I will ever be.
Well, that's it. You know, with the whole technology and thing you're talking about, with Instagram, just doing really well on Instagram. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Hamza. It was a pleasure.
You remember my name.
I did.
No, honestly, it was really insightful for me, and yeah, I'm glad I get to learn from people like you. I mean,
I learn from people like you too. I mean, look at this.
I don't know about that. This is just an excuse for me to pick people's brains.
Yeah,
really.
no, it's good. It's a great initiative.
Yeah,
To
appreciate
do
that.
this.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Great stuff. Right. What do we do now? We smash the place.